For more, we'll cross now to our Brussels correspondent, Dave Keating. Dave, what are we expecting France's priorities to be in its six-month presidency?
Well, Macron is expected to head three main themes in this speech: more ambitious EU action on climate change, taking on the digital tech giants, and making Europe more sovereign, and this idea of strategic autonomy, that Europe should have a more ambitious role in the world. Now, the general theme of this speech is going to be a Europe that protects. In other words, protects its citizens, protects the environment. But a lot of people will hear in that protectionism, particularly with the specific initiatives that Macron will mention in this speech, most significantly, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. He wants to push for that to be adopted in full as the European Commission has proposed it. That is also called a carbon border tax. It basically puts a levy on imports of goods from countries whose climate laws do not match the ambition of the European Union. It's designed to prevent carbon leakage, that is, companies producing goods outside the EU in order to avoid the EU's climate laws. Germany has been trying to water that down, so it would exempt the US and China. Those are exactly the countries that are supposed to be targeted by this. It's supposed to pressure them to actually get serious about their climate change laws. Also, Macron is going to push for getting tough on digital giants to make sure they pay their tax and to respect the privacy of citizens. Now, all of this is going to be coming in the context of the French presidential election, which is happening in April. That is going to have the weird dual effect here of both making this presidency more ambitious than presidencies normally are, because Macron wants to show action for that presidential election, but it will also serve as a distraction for the French government, and also risks kind of front-loading all of the actions here in the first couple months before that presidential election in April, and then having the French kind of disappear from Brussels at the end of the presidency in June and July, which are usually very critical months for any presidency because they have to make a final push for all of their priorities.
Dave, you mentioned that this is kind of meant to make the priorities, make them look more ambitious than they might really be. It makes me think that it is at the end of the day a rotating presidency that lasts for just 6 months, which means that member states are relatively limited in what they can accomplish. How much power do they really have, and what types of things do countries usually do when they hold the rotating presidency?
Yeah, essentially what Macron will say today in this speech is a perversion of what the presidency is supposed to be. There's a lot of misunderstanding about this. It's not the presidency of the EU, it's specifically the presidency of the Council of the EU, the Council of Ministers. That is the upper legislature in the EU's lawmaking body. It is not the presidency of the Council, the European Council of Prime Ministers and Presidents, which sets the general direction of the EU. There have been a lot of complaints that this presidency is a relic of the past. The presidency has not been in control of the European Council, and therefore the Prime Minister or the President isn't technically supposed to have a role in this since 2009. But when you get a very ambitious prime minister or president, they tend to jump in and try to set these big strategic objectives. Right now, Europhiles may really like the fact that Macron is taking a leading role here in the presidency, but they certainly didn't like it over the past months when the Slovenian prime minister, Janez Janša, who has far-right leanings and is an ally of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, when he tried to take an active role and set the agenda for the whole EU. He was basically just ignored, with people saying that's not the role of the prime minister. But now when it's President Macron, they may say something else. There are a lot of people who think that this whole concept of the rotating presidency needs to be gotten rid of because it's confusing for the public and for the media, and it's an obvious temptation for any country to hold it, to try to extend it and push it to something bigger than it's really supposed to be, which is really just a coordination role. They're really only supposed to be setting the agenda for the ministers when they meet, when the energy ministers come to Brussels to meet, when the trade ministers come to meet. They are not supposed to be pushing through ideas. But I think Macron has some very different intentions, at least for how to portray this presidency.
And adding to some of the confusion that you mentioned there, Dave, it certainly doesn't help that there is a presidential election in France in the middle of France's rotating presidency. We'll see where that'll make things end up. Dave Keating, thank you for that analysis there out of Brussels.